love Christ with all of your heart?
Probably not. That's a hard stunt to pull off.
So you could bring heaven here.
Or hell. You are not where you think you are. And you are not talking to who you think you're talking to.
If I'm not going to lie in front of my God, then I truly don't care to lie in front of you.
No, I think that's some of the least foolish things you've said so far today.
I don't even know how to take that. Is that like...
You're not getting control of my tongue.
Slavery that you've walked into. You've put the shackles on your own hands.
How many women can you stand?
Let me tell you.
And that really changed me, and permanently.
I know one day I'll be answering to that.
Well, it looks like you're answering for it right now.
I'm just playing, I don't fight, I do pray. I only go the way of Mr. Yahweh.
It's not often I sit down with somebody and they say something that makes me think.
Brother, this was great.
I love you guys.
Will you give me something to think about?
My own damn way.
I had a lot of fun on this interview. All right, guys, welcome back. This is I will say this is my most exciting podcast I've ever done. These two people have been with me since season 1, and you have been on my top list because the way you speak, the way you hold yourself, but most importantly, through your message. And this episode, I pray it opens up the eyes and ears to a lot of people, but I also want to challenge myself and think deeper, because I feel like when I watch you, when I get ready to take notes for guests, I study the way they speak, I study their mannerisms, and yours is heavily hard to follow because I feel like every time you have a thought, it's like you're truly examining it and reflecting so deep, it's like a rabbit hole. And so it's like very, very hard to track where you go with things. Has that ever gotten in the way of like your life? Does it ever get daunting reflecting that much?
Well, it's much more of a benefit than a cost. I mean, when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I started when I was about 20.
Wow.
And then I wrote for 15 years. And I was writing 3 hours a day. And I was thinking about what I was writing about pretty much all the rest of the time, although I also did a PhD in there and was doing scientific research. And that was kind of a break in some ways from writing the book. At that time in particular, I would say that was somewhat overwhelming because of the volume of thought that was associated with that and how much I was digesting and reading. And I straightened up my life a fair bit probably to deal with that too, and that helped. But mostly it's a benefit, as far as I'm concerned, to be able to delve into things and to be attracted by ideas and to be able to deal with them. It's very exciting. It's ridiculously exciting.
It's an
I mean,
adventure.
I'm dealing with things all the time that are so interesting that I can hardly even stand it. So that's really something, you know. I mean, that's what people want in their life.
There's a question you hate, and it's, do you believe in God? And I love your approach on that.
Well, people don't know what they mean when they ask that question. So
I would love you to elaborate on
it's
that.
nonsensical. Well, because what people usually want, Christians do this to me mostly, what they really want is they want me to validate their theory of belief. And they don't even know they have a theory of belief because they think what belief is obvious, and it's not obvious at all. Like, is belief your willingness to verbally assent to the reality of a set of facts? Well, that's what an empiricist would say, or a rationalist. And most Christians who ask me that question are rationalist empiricists, and they don't even know it. And so they want me to say, well, God exists the same way a table exists. And that's just not helpful. That isn't a helpful question. It's not formulated properly. And then there's many other forms of belief. So you can say one thing and do another, right? Then you might say, well, then what do you believe? Do you believe what you say, or do you believe what you did? And I mean, people are full of contradictions like that.
Well,
and so I would say,
I love that.
Generally speaking, what you do is a much more precise and accurate marker of what you believe than what you say. Now, if you were fully integrated, what you say and what you believed would be the same thing. But that's pretty damn rare. And people will say, well, I believe in Christ. And I think, you do you? Really?
Look at your actions.
What's the evidence for that?
You
Are
know
you
them by
moving
their
mountains
fruits.
with your faith? And if you're not, then you might ask, well, you know, just how deep is your belief? Because in principle, if you have sufficient faith, then you can move mountains. And so, and is that literally the case? That's a stupid question. So
He spoke in parables, so if you knew him, you knew what he was saying.
we move mountains all the time. We use like earth moving equipment to move mountains. We can move mountains, but and to some degree that's a manifestation of faith if you untangle it sufficiently. But when you read the biblical texts, for example, there's part of what you need to bring to bear on the stories is a bit of imagination. It's not a collection of scientific texts. That's not what it is. It's not even close to that. That's not what it is. So, and most people who say to me, do you believe in God? This question's just a trap. And the trap is, are you willing to tell me that what I believe to be the case about what I believe is true? It's like, no, because we're not coming at the question from the same perspective. So, and then people are irritated at me because they say, well, you can't question what the person means to believe. And it's, well, that's what they're doing to me. So I see absolutely no reason why turnabout isn't fair play. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in your belief? What exactly do you mean? And you're going to ask a question that there isn't a deeper question than that. That is the most intrusive possible question. And what, you're just supposed to, that's just something casual? It's not casual. Not in the least. What did they say? By their fruits you'll know them. Right, well, there you go. That's the right answer to that question.
I was sitting and I'm praying. I'm like, God, like, I know that question is pointless, right? Because obviously by your works, I know that you know that there is a creator out there and you're doing in every decision you can to not only please him.
I don't know if he's out there. Not sure exactly where he is.
Well, okay, fair. But so I was praying on it, and
they're under the bed.
There's the question, and it came to me, and this is it. This is the question that I would replace that question with. And it's, do you love Christ with all of your heart?
Probably not. That's a hard stunt to pull off. And it's a hell of a demand.
Do you love your daughter with all of your heart?
Same question probably, same objection probably applies. Like, none of us are unblemished vessels. So, no. Does that mean I'm not trying to? Well, probably to some degree it means that. That's partly what in the Gospels Christ says, not people were calling him good, and he said
why do you say I'm good?
That's right. There's none but God who is good. Well,
but he's patronizing them.
Yeah.
Because they were patronizing him.
It's not only, he may have been patronizing them, but to a point, with a point in mind, and not only that.
My mom used to always say, the only person you should look up to is Christ and the way he moves. And he was never disrespectful. The worst thing he ever did to somebody is let them go to their own decisions. And I found that to be very powerful, because you could really take down anything in your life without being evil. To be strong is to put the armor of God on, from my perspective, right? Another man might not see that. But the armor of Christ, it's actually pretty magnificent when you put it to the test.
What do you mean?
I believe that when we encounter evil, it's never the human, it's the spirit. And I believe that when we deal with people, we want to use emotions instead of like logic. And for me, the Bible verse says, be angry, but sin not. He obviously knows you're going to be angry, but how are you going to deal with it? And then how you deal with it will outcome where you go from that point. I believe my God to be a good father. So if I'm asking him for me to be a mighty man and a man that could help my family, that could provide, that could put on these cameras and open up people's hearts, you don't think he's going to put me to a test that could make me explain to people how to get out of their situations? You're going to have to be put in a very hard circumstance for you to get out of it. But that's what you prayed for. So, for example, when I moved on to do this show, the one challenging dilemma that I had was forgiveness. And as a Christian, that should be the easiest thing in the world. But it's
forgiveness is difficult.
It's very difficult. And how I stumbled upon it is...
Well, it's difficult partly because it's not easy to understand the preconditions under which it's appropriate.
Could you elaborate?
Well, you can't give forgiveness away casually.
It has to be asked. You can't just give it to somebody who hasn't asked. Is that what you mean by that? Like somebody's wrongs you, but you can't forgive them until they asked. Is that what you meant by that?
Usually, in the context of a relationship, look, if someone hurt you in the past and they're out of your life, there are practices that you might undertake to free you of the burden you might still be carrying because of their betrayal. But in the context of an ongoing relationship, it's very difficult and likely inappropriate to forgive without understanding. I mean, the process of forgiveness, say, among Catholics, Christians in general, but we'll stick with the Catholics for now, is, well, you have to confess, then you have to repent, then you have to atone. Like, there's a process.
Yeah.
And so, if I'm having a fight with my wife, let's say, or vice versa, and we're coming across an issue that's really quite sticky, and maybe there's some betrayal, real or imagined, involved, we have to get to the bottom of things. We have to sort out what happened. We have to set it straight, and then we both have to swear not to have that happen again. And then you can forgive and move on. But it's not like whitewash. It's not like you can paint over a situation. You have to deal with it. And then you're a fool not to forgive under those circumstances, because otherwise you propagate the cost. But these are very difficult things to manage.
What would you say, excuse me, in a situation where a person has done you wrong, and maybe that person doesn't see your point of view, they don't want to accept your point of view, and they think that they haven't done anything wrong, so they don't want to, they don't want to level with you or come to an understanding so that you are able to forgive them. In those situations, would you say that it would be best to kind of reflect on yourself, so kind of forgive them in a sense that you're forgiving them for yourself, so you don't hold that burden, but you won't forget what they have done, so you realize that maybe, they have a specific role in your life, and you treat them as that because of how they've shown themselves?
Well, the situation you described is a tricky one, and it's hard to give a generic answer. But one of the things you can do if you're attempting to deal with someone with whom you're struggling and have a conflict is, if they're not listening to you, you can stop talking. Right, that's very effective. So there is a biblical injunction in the Gospels not to cast pearls before swine. Okay, so now that's a very harsh statement, but it means something. It means something very particular. It means if you're attempting to communicate and you are not being listened to, you are misperceiving the person you're talking to and the situation that you're in. You are talking to someone other than the person who is there, and that's why they're not listening. Now, you might not be wise enough to fix that, but one of the things you can do is stop talking. This is very useful. I mean, purely practically. If someone isn't listening to you, you should watch for that. If they're not listening, you should stop talking and you should start watching like a hawk, because what's been revealed to you is the fact that your understanding of the situation is radically insufficient. You are not where you think you are, and you are not talking to who you think you're talking to. Now, if you cease talking and start watching and listening, they will tell you who they are and what they're up to. Now, that might take a while, although it generally happens faster than you'd think. And then they'll tell you. Right. And then the communication will start to flow again. It's a remarkable thing to try, and I've seen it happen.
Well, they've seen it happen. We literally, I was just dealing with a situation like that, and it's so funny. You guys will know exactly what I'm saying, where I said, God just kept telling me to shut up. And I was like, why? I'm always trying to fix it. I'm always trying to fix it because I think that's what I need to do. I need to fix this. And he just said, shut your mouth. And so I shut my mouth. And in the process of forgiveness, I'm over here just trying to be high and mighty, right? Because I hold the cross. And so I think I have to walk a certain way and talk a certain way. And pretending could be exhausting. And so I just straight up was like, I'm going to be real. I'm not going to lie. If I'm not going to lie in front of my God, then I truly don't care to lie in front of you. So when I told God, no, I don't want to forgive, but that is not being obedient. So I told him, I go, I'll walk in obedience, but I don't want to walk in obedience. And I've learned that that's still walking in obedience. So through that, I realized that the ones that I disliked, because I've walked with God, even though I didn't want to, it's like when your father says, come, you're going to see it from his perspective. And when I saw it from his perspective, I started to realize that the one I'm angry with is literally me. I am looking in the mirror. This is the same type of person. And so I'm realizing that we all have our own, quotes, demons that we're dealing with. And for me not to forgive is foolish, and it throws away my...
Well, why would you... One of the things you might ask yourself is, why would you not want to forgive?
Because I've done it 100 times over, and I'm sick of it, that I've given you my forgiveness, and you keep coming back and damaging me. Over and over to the point where it's like I'm exhausted. I can't do this anymore. And through this, where I let go of it was, as much as I saw that, oh, this is too stacked up in my point of view, God's going to see this and he's going to realize, all right, I understand you've been through this a lot.
Well, then we could ask, let's take that situation.
And I realized that the separation from hurt between me and my enemy is meaningless compared to the distance between me and my God who shows me mercy.
Well, let's say that you have forgiven someone multiple times and the transgressions continue. Well, so then you might ask yourself, well, what did you mean? What did it mean when you forgave them? Like if I just say to you, this is another example of the shallowness of just saying. Like I could say to you, I forgive you. I could pretend to myself that those words had significance, but if the problem that's at hand hasn't been addressed, then those words have no meaning. Like, and you can't force yourself to forgive someone. That isn't how it works. Forgiveness is actually extraordinarily difficult. Like it means making peace. And now, what you could say wisely is that if you were wise, you'd want to be in a position where if you could see your pathway forward to forgive, that's what you would do. And I would say you just do that practically. It's because, well, here's some questions. Do you want an enemy?
No.
Well, sometimes people want an enemy because it gives them something to wrestle with, or it gives them a reason to be a martyr, or it makes them think they're doing something important, or it's exciting to have an enemy because it's a false adventure. There are reasons, but it's dangerous to have an enemy, and so it's rather foolish if you don't need to.
It's a burden.
It's definitely a burden, and especially as the number of enemies mount and their seriousness, right? And it's a true danger. And so plus it's very exhausting to be angry and bitter and resentful, and it makes you hopeless and depressed. And so that seems to be relatively undesirable unless you want to be hopeless and depressed. And so if you were wise...
People search for that, though. People want to be in that predicament.
Well, people will choose false adventures if they don't choose real adventures. And being a martyr and being angry and having enemies, when they're unnecessary, those are forms of false adventure.
Hey, do you have a dog that you love? Good, because this video is sponsored by Dr. Marty. Now, you guys know that I have Tommy, and I wouldn't feed him anything that is just not good for him, right? Because that's your companion, that's your best friend. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. In fact, there's a veterinarian by the name of Dr. Marty. He created Nature's Blend. Before I even went and promoted it, I did two things. I wanted to, one, make sure that this is healthy for my dog to eat. So let me read you what this actually has. Turkey, beef, salmon, and duck, 0 artificial preservatives, additives, fillers, or any synthetic ingredients. Grass-fed and wild-caught. I eat that. It's a premium freeze-dried formula that is created here in America. The second step is, does my dog want to eat this? Yes. Yes. In fact, you should try it. And if you want to try this for your dog, I talked to Dr. Marty and I said, what do you got? And they said, if you use my code that is in the description, you get 56% off and you get a free doggy treat that is obviously very, very healthy for your pup. Go to drmartypets.com/George for 56% off and some doggy treats, or you can just click the link in my description. Seriously, go give this to your dog. If you love him, only if you love him. You talked about making peace, and in that circumstance when I was weak and I was at my lowest, I realized that every time I leaned on my understanding, I fell, but when I leaned on his word, it would set me free. And I really took into consideration that people would be like, you believe that God's here, why doesn't he come here? And I'm like, he is here. He first was the Word, then he was flesh, and now he's the Word again. So when I went to the Word and I was angry, the only thing that I could see is God didn't say be a peacekeeper. He said be a peacemaker. So
yeah, well, it's hard to make peace.
how do you do that when the other person doesn't want to play games? I can't dance with him if he doesn't want to dance.
Right?
So does that make you the evil one? Have you not figured it out?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question, actually, because one of the things you can come to understand is that as you become more sophisticated, you get better at making peace. And so then you might ask yourself, if you were as sophisticated as you could be, could you make peace everywhere? And the answer to that is, well, that's the limit case, and you likely fall short of that. In a more realistic way, if you're striving to make peace with someone and they reject it, then, well, that's a good time to reconsider your approach or possibly to turn your attention elsewhere. There's a time and a place for everything, and it isn't always the case that you have the sophistication to force peace on a situation prematurely.
This is actually a great pivot to exactly what you were saying. I'm going to use the reference reap what you sow, right? Christians love to say that. You reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. But when I'm studying this and I'm looking at it, I realize how much more God has his hands on this than we understand. A farmer, it's a beautiful parable, right? A farmer who's reaping what he sows cannot control the weather, cannot control the soil, cannot control the environment of animals coming and destroying it. There's so much more that God has his hands on that I've truly came to the realization that, for example, I'll use this interview, right? I could prep and have this conversation with you, but I would rather lean on God walking before me and taking control.
What does that mean practically when you're interviewing?
What was that? What do you mean?
Well, if you're allowing God to take control, what does that mean? You contrasted that with what you might do if you were prepping.
So exactly. I came to this yesterday when I was having like a little difficult time trying to figure out the perfect questions. But then I was starting to get anxious. And then I said, why am I anxious when I should put my faith in him and not me? So I could prep for 11 days in a row, but if I give him the ability to God is a gentleman, right? In every direction, he gives you the free choice. So I asked him, please take this situation and blossom it in the way that you would like it. Every situation that I'm at, when I ask a certain type of way, like when we go into prayer, which I want to circle back to, because that's a very strong point that I feel like people don't even know how to pray. But when I pray, when I was not wise in my faith, I would pray and ask him what I'm demanding. And it's like a genie type of thing.
Yeah.
But now I've realized that I'd rather be a guy. There's two men that stand before God, a one who wants and the one who is grateful. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather be the one that's grateful.
Why?
Because the one that wants is mustard seed. It grows to be an evil, evil thing.
So if you were over-preparing, let's say, there might be a number of reasons for that. One would be fear. The other would be the desire to impress, let's say. And you can imagine if you were interviewing someone that you were nervous about interviewing, that those two things might arise. But then the faithful path, and I think that's likely what you were searching for, would be to understand that if in the situation you admitted your ignorance properly, the appropriate questions would come to mind. This is one of the things that you see with someone like Joe Rogan. It's one of the reasons I like to talk to Joe, is because what Joe does, and this is partly why he's so popular, is that he just asks stupid questions, but they're real.
Yep.
Right? And so he's willing to admit his ignorance in the moment. If you're an interviewer and you're willing to admit your ignorance, you're never going to run out of questions. And then you don't have to. I mean, you want to prepare to some degree, right? Because you want to know who you're talking to. You want to be contextually aware. But
I want to respect your time.
Yes, that too.
I want to respect your time because...
You had a question earlier. Do you remember it? Just a bit ago.
I think I was going to add on to when we were talking about forgiveness, but
Yeah.
I like the position where we're at.
Okay,
But I appreciate
fine.
you.
I'm so sorry. I'm just like...
No,
like
not at all. But I do think that is very interesting because I think so many people's pride get in the way, right? Of course, when we sit with you, I mean, you're a doctor in psychology. the knowledge that you have in psychology, no matter the hours that I sit trying to learn about psychology, I will never come to know as much as you know in this, because this has been your career your whole life, right? So I think that it's interesting because, yeah, a lot of people would sit here and try and act as if like they know what you're talking about and they're on the same page and they know this information too.
Yeah.
Whereas when you can be humble and you can put your pride aside and be like, actually, I don't know about this, and the information you're giving me is something that I'm not well versed in, then you can find a deeper conversation.
That's a good observation, because it also makes you actually a better interviewer for your audience. I mean, one of the things I used to tell my students in my classes was, if you have a question, ask it. Now, you're going to reveal your ignorance in the question, and you're going to be afraid because you'll think you're the only person in the room that doesn't know. But what you'll find out is that everyone was having that question, assuming you were paying attention. And what you've actually demonstrated is that you were the only one courageous enough to admit it.
Right.
And so you can be a very effective interviewer and know very little, as long as the questions you ask are actually real questions, right? And then they don't have that pretense that you described of pride, right? And very good interviewers, that's what they're like. They're following the thread of the conversation. And so it is a good example of a path that's both divine and humble. And it's humble because you can't walk that path without admitting that you're ignorant. And it's divine because if you admit your ignorance forthrightly, you'll receive what you need to rectify it, and much faster than you generally think. When my daughter was learning to run businesses, we were frequently surrounded by people who claimed to be expert at such things, and it was difficult for us to begin with to distinguish between the wheat and the chaff. And she would ask these experts stupid questions, which they were frequently unable to answer in any comprehensible manner. And one of the things she learned quite quickly was that if they couldn't answer the stupid question, it was because they didn't know the answer. And I had encouraged her whole life, like her brother, to ask stupid questions, because you actually only have to ask a stupid question once.
Right.
Right.
Unless you're stupid.
Generally, unless you're not paying attention. Now, people do differ in their intellect, and some people can catch on faster than others, and some people need more basic explanations, more thoroughly developed than others. But most people who are paying attention can learn, right? And so willful blindness is much worse than lack of intelligence.
You wrestled with that, and now you pray that others don't.
Meaning?
Willful blindness.
Well, willful blindness is a great temptation, right? It's the most subtle form of lie, willful blindness. When you could know, but you turn away. Right? That's why there are none so blind as those who will not see, right? That's a form of failure to ask the question when it comes to mind.
You said
people do that all the time.
You said it in a beautiful way when she brought this up. You said you led with fear, the same way that I may have started to lead with fear when I was preparing for this. I journal a lot, and the reason I journal a lot is because I feel like I have so many fluttered thoughts that I know that if I write it down, I have to choose the most important thought that I have. And through my journaling, I found that I'm at my strongest stage when I fully focus on my fear of the Lord. And that's where wisdom begins. I believe that when I fear the Lord in any direction, failing him as a son to my mother, failing him as a interviewer and an opportunity to share the gospel, in any direction, if I focus on failing him, then no disrespect to you, I wouldn't care about failing you. So my fear that I had right here, when I challenged it, changed my perspective on who I should care more of failing. It lightened up the load of failing this interview. So would you not say that a man who fears the Lord is fearless to the earth, making him the strongest in the room?
I would say that, but I don't know precisely how you derived that conclusion from that introduction. That's not a criticism.
No. I'll explain.
So, yes, I believe that. So people tell me, upon occasion, frequently, that they admire my bravery. But they're not right about that. That's not right.
Because you're
I
still
just
scared.
fear different things than they do.
Yes.
So, and I think it is that is related to the point that you're making, because you need to know what to be truly afraid of. Okay, so you could be afraid of the opinions of men, and there's reason for that. But you shouldn't let your fear of the opinions of men let the cat get your tongue, because then you're not afraid of the right thing. When I objected to what my government was doing 7 years ago, the part that I objected to was compelled speech. It's like, you're not getting control of my tongue. Why? Because there's nothing worse than you can do to me, than that. Nothing. Now, you might not know that, but that means nothing as far as I'm concerned. So I was much more afraid of losing control of my tongue than I was afraid of losing my job. Why would I want a job if I had to lose my tongue to keep it? That's insane. It's far worse than insane. It's the very pathway to insanity. So, because one of the things you might ask yourself, for example, is, well, when should you not have your job? Like, no job is worth an infinite price. Well, here's a criteria. If you have to lie to keep it, well, why would you want that job? Unless the job you want is like professional liar. So for me, once even
Entertainment.
this was even true with the university, is that if the cost of me maintaining my university position is that I had to falsify my language, well, then what that means to me is that's not a place I want to work anymore. So, and that is, part of that is, say, fear of God, the fear of God that's the beginning of wisdom. Now, there's one of the most powerful presumptions, proclamations in the biblical corpus is that there is no better guide than the truth. And that's meant practically and theologically. It's actually meant. It's like, the statement is very straightforward.
But whose truth?
Well, it's got to be your truth in some sense, because all you have access to is your truth. Now, you can try to orient that truth to truth itself. You can struggle to do that, and you do that in a variety of ways, and you should do that, but you have to start with the truth as it reveals itself to you. But the notion is, and it's a very practical notion, and you could think of it this simply. It's like, how are you going to guide yourself through complex territory with a faulty map? I mean, if your presumption is, well, I need to lie to get through this. Well,
Fake it till you make it.
well, that's slightly different. That's an interesting variation, because sometimes when you adopt a new position, you have to act out the position before you're expert at it. And so sometimes fake it till you make it isn't a lie. It's just what you need to do when you've made a status transition. But often people will fake it instead of making it, and that's a very bad idea.
I think they fall into this trap when it comes to vanity. For example, this industry that I'm in, they'd rather live out an idea in front of people. I mean, it doesn't even have to be this. It could be anyone else, like when it comes to credit cards and chasing a life that you don't even deserve yet. And just to show people that you're there, you're setting yourself up in your own bondage. It's slavery that you've walked into. You've put the shackles on your own hands by pretending and punishing yourself, trying to keep your head above water to please the people around you.
Yeah, that happens to people.
And I feel like that happens a lot when you chase vanity. So you were saying perspective, and every time that you came to the conclusion of making a good truth in your eyes, your perspective was most likely in the perspective that God was seeing it at.
Well, I don't know if I would be presumptuous enough to assume that, but what I did try was to, and I do try, was to make sure that I could feel firm ground under my feet. Now, you can feel that, and if you're careful with your words, if you're putting on a show, you will become self-conscious. And the reason for that is because putting on a show is an expression of self-consciousness. Putting on a show means it's about you, by definition, right? You're displaying yourself for status, for example, to be the smartest person in the room for whatever short-term, self-centered gain you're currently after. Well, that makes you self-conscious. Okay, so one of the things you can do while you're speaking is you can feel whether or not what you're saying is making you self-conscious. And if it is, you can stop saying that. And that's a great relief, because there's actually very little that's more uncomfortable than being self-conscious. Now, if your words aren't designed to suit yourself, then they won't make you self-conscious. And there's nothing better than that. And then people will trade that. They'll trade that. It's like the pearl of great price, you know. They'll trade that for something of much lesser value. And that's foolish. Now, you know, sometimes there's a conflict because maybe you're called upon to say something that's going to cause you trouble in the short term. It's going to interfere with your perceived status, or it's going to cause you financial trouble even in the short run. And so you won't do it. You don't do it. But all you're doing is sacrificing the greater to the lesser. And see, I learned this partly by being a clinical psychologist. So one of the things I learned from being a clinical psychologist, also in my own family, was that if you have a disagreement with someone and you pretend that you don't, all that happens inevitably is that the disagreement deepens and multiplies and extends over a much longer period of time, even forever.
Resentment.
Yes, that's certainly one of its manifestations. Yes, well, resentment and lies, you know, like if we're in a relationship and I have to see you every day and there's something you do that annoys me, well, let's take that apart. So there's something you do habitually that annoys me. Okay, there's two possibilities. One is you're annoying. One is there's something wrong with how I'm looking at it, or some intermingling of those. Now, I could bring that up. Now, you might say, well, how would I bring that up? And I would say something like, when this happens, I find myself irritated. What do you think about that? And now I have to really want to know, because part of me is going to think, well, I'm hoping that it's you that's annoying and not me that's stupid. But I might be stupid. So I'm going to put it out there neutrally. It's like, let's sort this out, because I'd rather not be irritated with you. And so if you can figure out why I'm blind and you're fine, you tell me and I'll do what I can to sort that out. But if we figure out that you're annoying, then let's see what we can do about that so that I don't have to be annoyed with you every goddamn day for the rest of my life. Right? And that's a war, right? And that's often the sort of war that people don't want to have. And it's certainly the sort of thing they'll turn a blind eye to. But if you have 30 of those things with your wife, you're done. Your marriage is done. So
you're not being honest with one another. And I mean, it's because it's difficult to bring something up to somebody that then they feel like they need to either fix or change, or as you said, if maybe it's the way that you're perceiving it is wrong, then you need to fix and change that. And
and you don't know how deep that goes.
Right.
You know, that's the other thing. You see this when couples are trying to communicate, and often. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's say that you are doing something habitual that you don't know about that is actually annoying. And it's not just annoying, say, to me, but it's annoying to other people. And you really don't know about it. And so I bring it to your attention, and now we have to delve into it. Now, this could easily be reversed, but we'll use this example. We have no idea how deep down into your structure of assumptions we're going to have to go to find out why that's happening. And often what you'll discover is if you do this with people, you'll go down the rabbit hole, and first to anger, because people will get angry, and then to tears, right? And then that often fixes it. If you can get to tears, the person will have a realization and sometimes a transformation that will go along with that. But people don't like that. They don't like that. And no wonder.
Definitely. And would you say that then it comes back down to both parties being humble in that situation. So if I found out that I'm the one being annoying, I need to humble myself and have an open mind to what you have said and realize that, okay, yeah, I am being annoying. And I know it's embarrassing, but I need to figure it
Well,
out.
yes. Well, and also you do that with a certain kind of clear-headed realization. Like, this is the thing that's... So you're bound in a marriage, let's say. Now, the binding is you don't get to run away. Like, seriously. Well, so then you have a dilemma, which is, well, you're either going to confront this or you're going to live with it for the rest of your life. Now, that's not wise, because if there's something your wife is doing that you don't like, if enough of those things accumulate, you won't like her. Well, then that's terrible for her. And one of the things a wife might think if a husband is expressing his annoyance is, she might want to get to the bottom of that too, because maybe he needs some tooling, and that's certainly possible, but maybe she needs some adjustment too, because the alternative for her is to live with someone who pretends to like her. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know, if you want a hell, that's a good one. Oh, seriously.
It's Valentine's Day, and so I feel romantic, and I wrote a poem for you guys. You want to hear it? Roses are red, violets are blue. Trim your balls, and your date will thank us too. What's up, fellas? Valentine's Day is around the corner. Manscaped got the remedy that the love doctor ordered. His prescription? Let me tell you. It's the new Performance Package 5.0 Ultra, designed to elevate your grooming game and shine like the little heartthrob you are. A little personal experience about Manscaped to me. One, I could not believe how excellent it is at not cutting. The sensitive guy, man. Nothing's worse than going on a date and then trying to stretch and pretend like you're not trying to move your boxers around your balls because you're chafing. You don't want that, bro. You want to focus on the girl that you have right in front of you. So do yourself a favor. Get Manscaped and stop playing games with your balls, bro. That ain't something you play with. Well, I mean, you know what I mean. Join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped. With our exclusive offer, go to manscaped.com and snag yourself 20% off plus free shipping. Use the code GEORGE.
You know, it's like having a child who's very badly behaved, and you take that child out in public and everybody smiles falsely around them and pretends they enjoy the child's company when inside they're
bro.
Seething.
I'll call that out.
Well,
I tell that there all the time. Control your kids, bro.
Yeah.
Control your kids. It's annoying.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a certain utility in calling that out, but the problem for the child in that situation, especially if people say won't call it out, is that the child lives in a world of false smiles.
Right,
and your marriage can easily be a world of false smiles. And that's brutal. Brutal. Then you can't even complain because, well, everyone's smiling after all. Like, what's the problem? The problem is hatred in the guise of love. That's the problem. And that iciness that's underneath that, it's awful. People will lock themselves in like a homicidal embrace for decades because of that. It's brutal. Better to have the scrap.
I have to ask you this because in my relationship here with this incredibly beautiful girl, inside and out, extremely blessed to have you. And I'll publicly say it all the time.
What does she think about you?
He's a prince. That's what I think about him.
I appreciate that. But I had to humble myself to be the correct man. And so
how's that going?
Incredible when you realize that I ain't shit without God. You know what I mean? And so when you realize that I treat this relationship truly as if God gaveth me, but also can taketh away. So if I do not honor the gift that he's given me, which in the scripture says a good woman is one of the best gifts from God, then obviously he will remove me and give her to a man that's more deserving. And how I had to come to that conclusion is that I'm not right and I'm not always in the right path. And so that's scary when you love somebody and then you realize that you're bringing them along to hell if you're going the wrong direction. That could get, daunting. And my question is, our relationship found a very beautiful path when I said, hey, I'm going to lead this house, but also God's going to control it. So if I'm in the wrong direction and she prays about it, God will open up my eyes and ears and then I'll try to fix it, vice versa. But we have this counseling that we come to the Lord with. How did you manage to have a beautiful, successful relationship without a counsel from God if your wife didn't believe in God while you did? How is that not?
I don't think that wasn't the situation. I mean, first of all, people believe in God to a greater or lesser degree in some ways, regardless of what they say or think. So even people who are atheistic, it's a surface presumption mostly.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean partly that we're opaque to ourselves, and so you can say you're an atheist, but that doesn't mean you are one. So that just like saying you're a woman doesn't make you a woman if you're a man, just like that. So, my wife, I wouldn't say my wife ever was atheistic in her orientation. She certainly agreed when we decided to get married that she was going to tell me the truth. And that's a form of faith, a deep form of faith, at minimum a form of faith in the truth. And that's a good start.
Can I ask, before you peel the layer on that, so that way I make sure I'm following, are you saying that with her mouth she said that there's no God, but with her actions she said there is a God?
Well, she never said that with her mouth either. I mean, she was never an avowed atheist. She didn't go to church. She had drifted away from church,
But where is your counseling? And how do you, so your beliefs are in a higher God and you run your household. How do you run your household when one doesn't want to play ball with the fact that there is a creator out there that gave you a set of instructions to have a beautiful, fruitful relationship?
She did play ball.
Okay.
She agreed to tell me the truth, and she did that very, very diligently, I would say. Very diligently. And
how is her faith now? I know your new
it's
program
deepening.
is that what opened up her eyes? Because that's what I was reading, that your wrestle with God kind of helped her.
People's eyes open for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of the things that happened, multiple things happened to Tammy. I mean, she spent a lot of time meditating. She did yoga for decades, and that trained her ability to attend quite remarkably. She's a very physically disciplined person. And then when things blew up around me, she decided to climb on board more professionally and started working with me and touring with me. And one of the consequences of that was that she sat in the audience while I lectured 200 times, and some of that made a difference. And then she became very ill and just about died, and every day for 8 months, and just about starved to death. And
I'm sorry you had to deal with that.
Yeah.
well, that was just one of many things that was happening at the time, because I was
That's
also
tough to
very
deal
ill,
with.
and my daughter was very ill. Yeah, well, it was quite the ringer, and so that also forced her and invited her to take herself and her life more seriously. But it wasn't just the suffering, because one of the things that happened too, as a consequence of her developing a fatal illness, was that she came to the realization that her life meant more than she thought it did, not least because she saw, especially in her son's reaction to the news, how much her absence would mean to him. Wow. And so that's a lot of factors that were at play simultaneously. There's more than that, too.
There's a factor that I just can't stop thinking about, and it's, as a Christian man, what did it do to you to see your loved one, God forbid, almost leave without knowing God? And we know the repercussions of that. Was that terrifying?
Well, I didn't formulate it that way. I mean, first of all, was I not judging her? I never formulated what was happening to her in those terms. I mean, what was horrifying about it? Well, it was horrifying. It was terrifying, painful. Not terrifying, painful to see her suffer, but was it terrifying to see her suffer in the absence of sufficient faith?
No, I'm just saying, if God forbid she passes
because
away.
she developed that very rapidly as it became necessary, increasingly necessary. I mean, Tammy decided very early on in the process that she was going to accept what was coming her way, and that she was going to make whatever changes were necessary and were offered to her, and that she accepted what happened to her with incredibly good grace. She's a very strong person. And so
She was disciplined before that, so it's probably easy for her to.
well, it certainly
disciplined.
helped.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
What do you think a man needs to be able to go to heaven?
What do you mean? What do you mean by heaven?
Heaven is God's home, so it's not our choice.
Truth.
Yeah, truth.
Sure.
What truth? Yours or God's?
You asked that before, so I'm not sure what distinction you're drawing.
Reed has a truth, but in the eyes of God, that's lies. So in the grand scheme of things,
Well,
no.
some of it might be. Some of it's probably, reasonably
Hypothetically,
accurate.
we'll say that one's a lie. But from
I mean, he misses the mark from time to time.
well, I'm just talking about the who is in charge, the creator, right? So that truth is not it's not a perspective thing. It's either you know or you don't know. And so when
Well,
you stand,
the question is so the question you're posing to some degree is,
when you knock on God's door, what grants you into his home? Because that day is coming. Every knee shall bow, willing or non-willing. So your truth or the man next to you's truth is meaningless. What is the truth to let him come into the kingdom of heaven?
well, it isn't that your truth is meaningless. It's that see, this is where the words get tricky, because modern people tend to think that truth is a set of descriptions of facts. But that's not what the truth is. The truth is, for example, the truth is the process by, the truth is your willingness to make manifest the process that enables you to learn and progress. Right? That's closer to what the truth constitutes, a process. That's why the truth is often represented as a spirit, right, rather than a set of descriptions. This is partly why I take offense, let's say, to some degree when people ask me if I believe in God. It's the same problem. People think of truth as something like fact, and that's not what it is. That's one tiny aspect of what it is.
I think that's the
So, and
first
then
thing
you said truth, my truth, your truth, rather than God's truth. Well, see, whether those two things are distinct to some degree depends on how you conceptualize yourself. It might be true that you want something right now, let's say. And you might say, well, that's not a want that's in keeping with the ultimate and transcendent truths, and that could well be. But the problem there that you're facing to some degree is that you've identified yourself with that local want. So when you say my truth, when you're talking about, I don't mean mine personally, I mean personal truth, and you say that's in opposition to God, I would say, well, personal truth is in opposition to God in proportion to the degree that that person is self-obsessed. See, because yourself, the way you conceptualize yourself could be much broader. And then your truth would be more tightly aligned with what was transcendent. So, for example, look at it this way. Let me make it relatively straightforward. So, when you get married, the difference between you and your wife is supposed to disappear. Okay, so let's think that through, like really practically, not theologically, just practically. Well, why should that border be erased? Well, the reason is because the border will be erased. Because if you're going to live with someone for the next 50 years, they're as much you as you are. Not least because, well, there they are, like right beside you. There they are talking to you. There they are walking with you on the beach. Like they're literally part of your experience. Literally. And they're certainly a part of your experience that can make your life hell if they're not attended to properly. So like once you're married like that, the difference between you and your wife is insignificant. And so if you don't act like that, then all hell's going to break loose. if you do act like that, now imagine what you've done to your conception of yourself. Now it's broadened to include someone else. And so then I would say, insofar as you serve that more broadened self, you've stepped quite a long ways out of your narrow self-concern into something that much more closely approximates a relationship with God. That's why marriage is a sacrament. That's why marriage is a Christian sacrament, is because entered into in the proper spirit, it's a step up Jacob's ladder.
But is your truth, and say you accumulated a whole population of Canada to be all on your truth.
Yeah.
Is that greater than God's?
Well, that's a reasonable question, because, and what you're pointing to there is the potential. I see what you're after there. Well, people will find truth through consensus, and there are people who claim, especially in a morally relativist perspective, that there is no truth other than consensus. But that brings you to a problem very rapidly, because you can end up with a consensus like the Nazi consensus, right? Where everyone believed, for example, that, well, the Jews were the great enemies of the German state, and all of the atrocity that came along with that, everyone played along with, at least, even if they weren't active agents. So that was a false consensus. And your question is, well, what is there to protect against that false consensus? That's a very good question. And I would say, well, certainly traditional conceptions of God are one of the things that protect us against false consensus. There's no doubt about that.
It's a double-edged sword, because also tradition fights back on what God wants.
Well, that's sure. And then you might see in that eternal conundrum faced by liberals and conservatives, because the conservatives would say, watch out for the now, because it can get out of hand. And the liberals will see, yeah, but you can make a dogma out of tradition and wield it like a hammer. And both of those are true. And well, that's partly why the truth has to be a dynamic process, rather than, say, a set of statements, a set of factual statements. So
my truth growing up was that you need to be baptized. And then my truth grew into you need a relationship with Christ. And then when I actually started looking for Christ, not because my mom and dad told me to, but because my heart yearned for it, I fell into this part of the Bible where they did talk about a man who goes into heaven. And it was the thief on the cross. And that man never went down and did charity. That man never went down off the cross and got baptized. That man never shook his neighbor and says, it's good news, Christ is coming back. But he looked at Christ in his face amongst everyone who stared at him, and he said, he is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. He is the one true God. Do not forget me when you go to heaven. Mm-hmm. And God said, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think that means?
Because he knew who God was and what he was doing for him.
Okay, and what's the implication of that?
The implication is, regardless of how much you emphasize or manifest your truth will never be bigger than God's.
Okay, well, I would say, with all due respect, that's close.
Fair.
Well, okay,
I take that with respect. I take that with respect.
Yeah,
close.
Well, I think that, like, you're on the trail of something there. So there's an idea that no matter what your sins, if you confess, then you can be forgiven. And in some ways, to confess is to admit your insufficiency in relationship to something higher than you. That's a good way of thinking about it. That is what happens to that thief. So he's a bad guy, but on his deathbed, he recognizes the truth, and that's sufficient to redeem him. Now, in practice, people criticize that sort of idea, because you might say you could play both ends against the middle then, and so your best bet is to be like hedonistic mafioso until you're 85, and then to, repent on your deathbed. And
that's a cop way out, because
I know. That's my point.
Yeah. Because they love to say that. They love to say, but remember, God doesn't judge your actions; He judges your heart. You can't hide your heart from God. So in the scripture, it says it's better for you not to know and do that crime than for you to know.
Yes, definitely.
Exactly.
Yes, definitely. So the problem with a deathbed confession is that in order for it to take, you have to get to the bottom of things. And if you'd accrued up a whole hell of lifetime catastrophe, you'd have to face all that.
Well, it also comes with regulations, right? A judge, per se, is standing before you, and you, in your heart of heart and your truth, is I was checking on my toddler. I thought he was choking, and I accidentally hit a red light. And the judge does not care because you hit the red light. So he's judging you on what your crime was. Now, he could show you grace, but you still did the crime. So it is in the hands of the judge. So when you stand and tell your truth to the judge, it's in his hands. So when he gives you rule books, like, for example, how you judge your neighbor will be measured to how I judge you. That's a very big standpoint. When it came to forgiving other people, I asked God, why should I forget other people? Like, why? Because respectfully, F that dude. I tried over and over and over again. Why would I? And then when I get hit with a fierce statement of how you measure how much you forgive somebody, I'm going to take that same measurement and measure you with it.
Yeah, well, that's an inevitability. That's another example of the pragmatic utility of those injunctions. So you could imagine if you're a habitually harshly judgmental person. And so everyone around you that interacts with you comes to experience that. They'll reflect it. So you will be judged by the standard that you use to judge others. That happens almost immediately.
Yep.
But there's more to it than that, because if you develop a very harsh set of judgmental standards and you apply them to others, you'll use the same tool on yourself, because the probability that you're sophisticated enough over any reasonable amount of time to conjure up one set of standards for everyone else and another for you, it's like no one can handle that balancing act, that juggling act. Those things will interpenetrate. And so that is relevant to an issue that we discussed earlier, which is the issue of forgiveness. I mean, part of the reason that you want to do what you can to set yourself up so that you can forgive is so that the same grace will be extended to you. So, for example, if we go back to a concrete situation, so you're married to someone, now you're going to interact with them tens of thousands of times, right? And so you will encounter problems together, and sometimes there'll be problems that you cause, and sometimes there'll be problems that he causes, or some joint contribution. Well, whatever grace he shows you in the negotiations when you're at fault, that's exactly what you'll reflect back as the marriage progresses. Obviously, because, well, obviously, how else could it possibly be? And so you do, and the marriage is a very good example of this, because it's the tightest example. It's like you will receive what you deliver in a marriage, and often very rapidly. Yeah. And that's a very useful thing to understand, because then you can ask yourself, and this is the same gospel injunction about wanting to be treated like you would, treating others like you would want to be treated. It's like, that's something you really want to apply to your wife, not least because you're stuck with her. Like, she's a mirror. She's a mirror.
So you're saying it's kind of when we're in a situation, and if he's, not showing me, quite grace, and he's taking things very harshly, and he's being very hard on me, then it's kind of the way that he's treating me in this situation. I'm going to be like, I'm going to remember that for when the roles are reversed.
Well, partly it'll be conscious, but partly you'll just come to imitate that, and even unconsciously. Because it'll become the pattern of your relationship.
Yep.
Right. And so sometimes you'll wield that like a club. You did this to me, so now I'm going to deal that way with you. Right. But often it's just more subtle.
You don't even know it.
No, and you practice what you become, and you also become what others near you practice. Because we're very imitative creatures. Yep. And so
we're sheep.
We certainly have that aspect. We can also be shepherds, so
yeah.
So the metaphor extends in all sorts of different directions. And it is also good to know. One of the things my wife and I learned to do, and we literally do this, is if we're caught on the horns of a dilemma and we can't get out of it. We'll stop arguing if we have enough sense. Because, you know, if you get angry, both of you want to win, and that's not helpful. You can't, that's another thing to know. You cannot win an argument with your husband. And he can't win a husband can't win an argument with his wife. Not unless he wants to defeat her, in which case...
He defeats himself.
Well, he lives with a defeated woman. Like, well, seriously.
I thought he was going to go so deep with it.
Well, what good is that going to be? That's not helpful.
And like, you guys are one. So if you defeat her, you defeat yourself.
Well, not least because now you're living with someone who's defeated and bitter. It's not helpful. You can't win an argument. What you have to do, you can't stomp around and insist that you were right. Look, this happens to couples all the time. So imagine that one person in the couple is better at verbal disputes than the other. That doesn't mean they're smarter, and it doesn't mean that they're more
I just said
correct.
this. Yeah. You're just good at your skill of talking.
Yeah, exactly. Now, so one of the things you want to do, so imagine in a relationship that, so what do you want to do about that? If you happen to be the person who's better at making verbal arguments, well, one of the things you want to do is, if your wife has a problem with you, you want to help her make her argument. Just on the off chance that she's got something to say, because maybe she's right, you know, and it's going to be in her interest to straighten you out if she has any sense, and it would be in your interest to listen. And so that's part of giving the devil, that's part of loving your enemy, that's part of giving the devil his due. It's like, you want to find out, so you don't have to bring the trouble forward.
We're getting deep. I would love to be vulnerable. And if you want to cut this out, we could absolutely cut it out, because obviously when I get vulnerable, it disgusts you.
And rightly so.
But before I do, I'm just going to go pee real quick. Could you refill his drink?
Yeah, of course.
I'll just be right back. I'm sorry, I drank a lot of Celsius to get ready.
No problem. No explanation necessary. So now, are you participating in all of these podcasts?
Yes. Yeah, I'm his co-host. I wasn't able to go to the Andrew Tate one because, I mean, obviously, you know, he was going to Romania. He didn't know Andrew Tate, you know, so because of that reason, then he thought, you know, we thought it'd be better for me to stay back on that one and for him to go in.
Thank you.
And then, and yeah, so usually for the most part, I'm always there with guests, unless it's something that, you know, speaks to George's heart where he feels like he wants to, you know, be there one-on-one, but he enjoys having me.
And how long
there with
have
him.
you been doing the podcast together?
I started with him when he started this by himself, so about a year.
I see.
Yeah.
And are you enjoying it?
I'm absolutely enjoying it.
Are you getting better at it?
I think so.
She is. What and how is she getting better? What's better?
I'd say just adding to the knowing when things don't get fully
I see.
articulated.
Yeah.
And because George can be very like linear and just go, and Belle will sometimes be like, "Don't forget about this part," and because
Right. So she's tracking.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's helpful.
Just being another perspective. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank
so
you.
excited.
Yes. Well, you ask pretty clear-headed questions, and they're quite personal.
Thank you.
I don't mean that they're personal questions that you make of your guest, but they're not abstracted.
Oh,
You know, and
thank
so
you. I appreciate that.
yeah. Well, that's useful. That'll also help. That'll make it easier for your guests to also see where you're coming from.
Thank you.
So-
Yeah, it's all very new to me, but I've been really enjoying the process of it and sitting down with people and having these conversations. And, you know, I'm not somebody who's as well, you know, versed in certain debates and things like that, but I have a great interest in how people think. And my first love is acting. And so, you know, I'm an actress, and the reason why I got into acting actually is because I'm so interested in the reason why people do the things that they do and understanding kind of like what's built them up to be the person that they are. So in a sense,
So you can explore that through acting,
right,
by
and
taking
through
on
characters.
different roles.
Yeah, and you know, kind of picking apart their lives, and that's what interests me.
Many people told me not to have her as my co-host when I started. But the two things that hit me in the head was my friend told me when you do podcasting, you're going to grow rapidly because you start monitoring how you speak, how you talk, and it just makes you have to hold yourself at a level of like respect. And then two, she's just like, I truly think she's like this incredible woman. I learned so much from her, and my goal was to teach people things that I'm learning as I'm growing. And so if I'm going to grow stronger and wiser, and I have a platform, why not bring my partner?
Well, you know, one of the things I've learned, so Tammy started to do the intros for my lectures when we're touring.
Yeah.
And to begin with, she was just announcing some of the endeavors that we were engaged in. This essay app that my son and I developed to help people learn to write, and Peterson Academy, this online university that I'm launching with my daughter. And so Tammy would describe them. But then she started to talk about the rules in my book from a personal perspective and started to develop a corpus of her own stories. And so that's been fun. But also I had her, I invited her to ask me, to take questions from the audience and ask me the questions, because there's a Q&A at the end. And one of the things we found, which was very interesting and that we didn't expect, was that the audience very much appreciated the fact that we were together on stage and interacting. And we learned, part of that was, and this is something to know too, is that there are a lot of people out there who've never really watched a civilized interaction between two people in a man and a woman in an intimate relationship. They just don't have that in their repertoire. And so the fact that we were doing this and could do it together, and that she could ask me questions and tease a bit and play and listen, let's say, and chime in from time to time, people found that intriguing, and they also found it comforting in a way, because if people are gathering something of value from your words, they're hoping that the source is real. They're hoping that it's not an act, that it's not show. And one of the ways that you can test that is by watching the person interact, let's say, with their wife. It's very direct, right? And it's a hard thing to fake, especially continually. And so I think it was good for people in relationship to example, but it also helped them ensure that their trust wasn't misplaced.
That's very interesting. That's it
was very interesting. We didn't expect that.
And I'm sure for your audience, the people in your audience, a lot of people don't come from homes where their parents are still together, and so
or
that's
where
also,
they ever talked,
right? And
which is why often they're not together,
right?
Because they didn't communicate, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Communication is key.
Biggest thing.
All right, time to get vulnerable.
Oh no!
And again, babe, if you want me to take this out,
Oh yeah.
you can take this out.
forgot about this.
And if we don't,
Okay.
then it'll just be something that I at least got blessed with an opportunity to have a conversation with you about. When I wasn't in a relationship, I would, have fun. Because the people that loved me, even though they were Christians, were like, hey, go have fun, go have sex, go enjoy before you get married. And they would build up marriages. This is like, okay, that's it. It's final. You only get one woman. So when I
How many women can you stand?
let me tell you, it was a turbulence of life, and it's a lie that they try to sell you. The music, the movies, all that stuff it's all full of shit. But I had to learn that the hard way, sadly. And God willing, I could teach my son that that's a bunch of bullshit. Sorry for my language. I know I'm trying to swear. It was a non-Christian man that actually challenged me.
What was wrong with it?
Is emptiness. It was me searching for a love where my perspective now, my POV now is love is your dance with God, right? So you could find love in the worst case scenarios in life, but if you bring God involved, you could be in the trenches and still have peace and joy.
Well, in these relationships that were primarily aimed at sexual pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, what exactly was the problem with that? Like specifically? Why was that? I've talked to other people about this, and some people.
Yeah,
I've talked to Russell Brand about this, for example, and Russell had plenty of opportunity for, extra for casual sex.
Yeah,
right.
I
So
think-
what was wrong with that?
I think every man will have his own version of why it was wrong for him, right? Russell might have a different version of why it was wrong for him. My version was I loved God, and I knew that I wasn't walking in obedience. So
How did you know?
my mother told me.
Okay, but why did that stick?
Because the scripture says to honor your mother's teachings.
Yeah, but it must have okay.
So I was embarrassed of calling my mom saying my condom broke. I think I got a hoe pregnant, and now I think my actions are going to be
shame
led.
in front of your mother.
Yeah, and now I'm embarrassingly asked my mom to fast so that way I don't have a baby with a girl that I never met and I don't want anything to do with. It's shameful.
So why did you care what your mother thought?
Because if I fail to care what my mother thought, then what kind of son of a bitch would I
Well,
be?
it depends. I mean, no, but there are people whose relationship with their mother is disturbed enough so they don't care what she
Exactly.
thinks. So why did you care what your mother thought?
Because God blessed me with two parents that I should kiss the ground that they walked on, let alone care what they think of.
Okay. So you had a good mother.
A great mother.
Yeah,
Better
okay.
than I even deserved, but God blessed me with one.
Right. Okay. So it mattered to you what she thought, and you felt that. Well, you can imagine what that means too, because your mother's a woman. So if you were mistreating other women, then,
Never did. Never. I was good at that. I was good at that. I was good at being able to be honest with them and like, hey, this is a fun time. Even if they were like a girl, like a random, quote unquote, like hoe from the streets, like I would still take them out, buy them flowers, open the door for them. I never disrespected, no matter what class girl was.
except for the sex.
I say my slang, my line is, I'm a gentleman until the bedroom door locks. And so that's the, like I told you.
That was the cover story.
I told you I was going to be very vulnerable. But this is the best part is that she knows everything about me. I know everything about her.
Well, I
Oh,
think
that
how
must be horrible.
no, but how I see in these situations is that I thought you were going to bring up something about us, and
No, I am. I'm just walking my way to
Oh,
it.
okay. But for this part, I mean, that's
No.
your past is your past,
Trust me,
so-
this is the easy part. All right. Okay. So then an atheist actually said, "You believe in God?" And I go, "Yeah, of course." And I'll have these conversations that I have behind cameras. And he goes, "I don't get why do you go around sleeping?" And I said, "I'll treat the right girl right when God brings me the right girl." And he says, "Well, if he's your father in heaven," he goes, "why would he bring you the right girl when you're acting wrong?" And I was like, "Whoa." So I changed my approach, became abstinent, and through that, I was blessed with the opportunity to meet her. But my behavior didn't change. We didn't wait till we were married, and this is where I'm circling towards because you're a scholar, and I know that you've dove into the Bible in a sense of faith-based like examination, and also logically understanding what a parable might be. Like for example, get up, move a mountain, and go that way. When I would have sex with Belle, Shauna, I was aka Belle. This is I'm so uncomfortable. This is like I would ask her to remove her cross from her neck because I wouldn't be able to even perform.
That should have been a hint.
Yeah. And while she got to the point where she would take her cross off, and sometimes when we carried on through the day, I realized that her cross is off, and that's because of me. And
Oh yeah.
and that rocked me because I knew that I voluntarily. I pushed the person that I love the most in the wrong direction, and I know one day I'll be answering to that. And,
Well, it looks like you're answering for it right now.
and it was something that was really challenging for me. And it got.
Did you learn?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
And I would have conversations with God, and there would be times where we would go a long time without doing it, and then I'd break down to the stupid man that I am today, and I would fall again, and I would get up, but the one thing that I can't get off my chest and it is stuck there. It's when I asked her to marry me, and I made a promise to God first, and then I made a promise to her father on earth, that when she is mine, I will honor her like my church. Mm-hmm. And there was this thing in my chest, man, like it immediately when I had his blessing, it left me. And I felt like this, like God forbid I had cancer in me, and it just died and it left. And I couldn't unshake it. And so we had our relatives over, and she had to go with her father. I had to go this way. So the magic was still, we were dancing between just being engaged. And so finally I was like, we made a promise, like when we get engaged, we're not going to do anything until marriage. And then we were distant. And finally when we saw each other and we were in the moment, obviously we were going to, fail and have sex. But right before we had sex, I looked at her and I had no shame about the cross being on her anymore. And I said, leave it on. I don't know why, but it was so there. That feeling of like, I felt like when God looked at me before, he wasn't pleased with me. But at that moment, he was pleased with me.
Okay, what had changed?
So I searched for it because I was like, I feel it. It's a spirit. I feel it. And I dove into the Bible. Where in the Bible does it say a priest has to ordain it, or there has to be another man that tells me, do you take her, or do you take this? And I'm trying to dig. And then I call my friend Cliff, him and his son Stuart. They go around and they talk about the gospel, and he's a great man that I could call. And he always answers. And I'm crying on the phone. I go, Cliff, I can't find where the marriage ceremony is that God blesses a man. All I could find is that when the father gives permission. And then I thought, as humans, when we corrupt God's word, we always place a man in between us and God, that this man has to finish up God's work. And then I thought, well, it just makes so much sense that if I would have taken a woman for her house, all I really truly need in God's eyes is the permission of her father. So now I'm looking through the scripture and I can't find anywhere besides showing the world that I've made a promise to her. And that is now my covenant with her. So what I'm going to is now when I look at her, I don't feel like I have to wait for a man to tell me that you're now married. I made that promise to God. And when I look at her, this woman, I almost feel guilty telling people that that's my fiance when in truly I feel that's my wife already. I've made that promise to God. I've already showed it to the world that that is my woman and that's my covenant. What is your thoughts behind this? Am I just a fool trying to look for another way into having sex without any guilt?
No, I think that's some of the least foolish things you've said so far today.
I don't even know how to take that. Is that like a good thing?
No. Well, no. Yes, it's a good thing. It's a good thing, and it wasn't an insult to the other things you said. It was an answer to your question about what I thought about what you said. Okay, so what do I make of it? Well, the first thing I would make of it is that you were and are far more traditional than you wanted to think. I mean, because the story you just said had two components that you just told me. Number one was when you were casually sleeping around, you were actually violating your covenant with your mother.
Yeah.
Right. And you were violating that not least because she was a good woman, she was a good mother. And that meant in some ways, what would you say? She was emblematic of women as such, and you were violating that in your behavior. And so you couldn't face her.
My truth was that I told her already. So I told my parents, like, hey, guys, I'm just going to be doing this. And I thought that that's my truth.
Right.
But my truth is garbage.
Well, that's what I meant earlier when I said that truth is not merely what you say. Right. That's a good example of that. Now, it turns out that you were traditional in more than one way, deeply. One was that you were traditional in relationship to your mother, but you were also traditional in relationship to the father. Because some of what you were doing with women, given that it wasn't smiled upon by the father, violated the basic precepts of your conscience. Now, you might say, why didn't you pay attention to that? That's easy. It's like, well, you can't pay attention to that and have casual sex. So, people will choose the hedonic route in a second. And that's particularly true in a culture like ours where that's celebrated and any objection to it is in some ways even demonized. Who are you to say that, there's something wrong with casual sex? It's like, for me, casual sex is a contradiction in terms. I just think it's a preposterous concept because I don't think that anything that intimate can be casual. Like, intimacy and casualness, they're not.
Oxymoron.
It's like the unity of diversity.
It's in the word intimacy.
Well, yes, that's right. It's
right.
exactly. It's already in that, and so. Okay, now the next part of it you said was that as far as you're concerned, at some deep level, you're already married. Well, that could be. I guess what I would ask you then is why bother with the ceremony? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't at all. I'm not saying that in the least. But
I could answer that. Those
okay.
Please my parents.
Yeah, okay.
Because the scripture does say honor your mother and father.
Right.
So even if my mom and dad were like, yo, we're going to hang a tree from the ground and light it on fire and that will be your ceremony, even though I don't find that to be true, I am honoring my mother and father to the sacrament that they want.
Well, you can imagine that there's multiple reasons.
But my mother always taught me to love God more than her, so I have no problem denying her will if it's under God's will, right? So like if God says do something and my mom says do something, my mom has trained me to be a man, to look at my mother as the foolish woman she is in that moment and to lean on God's understanding, not my mother's understanding. So what I want to ask from you is whose understanding is the truth? Is it my mother's understanding of I need a priest to ordain this and to make it finalized, or do I lean on what I'm reading in the scripture. But again, I'm 31. Yeah, I'm sitting on a camera and I'm explaining my deepest thoughts, and people are following and they're thinking I'm wise. I'm not wise. I tell people this. I'm not a preacher. I'm a man who fears God and loves to talk about it. So my fear is that when I say something like this and another man out in Ohio is like, yeah, I feel the same, and then he goes that direction, well, then it's better.
Well, okay, I would say that to some degree, you're falling prey to the same temptation that I heard many young men, for example, in my clinical practice, tell me in relationship to marriage. They would say, why do I need a piece of paper? Like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm married. Right. Now, their partner didn't always agree with that sentiment. In fact, generally not. And that's generally the case with women. But their claim would be, well, my heart's already in it. And I think the proper objection to that, and I think you've already touched on that by this proper objection, is that marriage is not only a private and subjectively defined state, no more than identity is. You know, in our culture, we clamor to insist that I am whoever I say I am. Well, you're not. Your identity is negotiated with other people. And a marriage is also not only private, it's also the bedrock of society as such, but it's also an institution that, even in the personal case of you two, will have a branching effect on many, many other people. Your parents, your siblings, your children, your cousins, the people who watch you. And so that part of it, your commitment to the social part of your marriage, which would include the honoring of your parents, that's also important. There's a reason that since time immemorial, people stand in front of their community and make their vow. Now, it also may be that, as far as you're concerned, you know, your heart's thoroughly into this, but your marriage is going to go like this, you know, and the downtimes where you might be tempted to stray, you may need every bit of reinforcement against that straying accessible to you. And one of those means of reinforcement is, well, you didn't just tell her. You told her and everyone else publicly that this was your decision. And that
but I already did that. I already did it. It's already public. That's the thing that I'm wrestling with. My wrestling is, even if she herself, the one that I look at and now I see as one, my covenant, right? If she's like, I want to get married.
Yeah.
I'm not wrestling with if I want to please her or please my parents. It's the thing that we were saying, the truth, right? If everybody here says, no, George, this is what I had to do, it's meaningless to me what they feel if it goes against what my Christ feels. So I'm trying to see, what is your thoughts in the Bible?
Well,
does
why
it
not
say?
bring it all together?
Never thought of it that way.
You know, I mean, you know, fair
I guess
enough,
I'm so
but
worried. I'm like tunnel vision, because every time I widen my perspective and I lean on what they would like, it always ends up.
I see the problem. Oh, I see. Well, no. Okay, that's okay. I see. No, that's a reasonable objection. But look, imagine you're looking for the optimized solution.
Yeah.
Okay, then bring everything together.
Yeah.
Right. So what you're saying is you don't want to sacrifice, at least to some degree, you don't want to sacrifice your like intense preoccupation with leading an appropriate and godly life. You don't want to sacrifice that even to consensus.
Not even for a little bit.
Well, then don't sacrifice it. Bring them together. Make the consensus work in the same direction. Well, that's what look, if you have a good marriage day, that's what'll happen. And so I can tell you how to do that. I had a good marriage day, and I've officiated at a number of weddings, and I've seen ones go well and badly. What to do at a wedding is quite straightforward, is invite the people you want, and maybe even some of the people you don't want that your parents want, right?
Honoring them.
Because that's part of, but
because it's their son.
Yeah, that's right. You bring your community around you, and you're hospitable to them, so they're welcome. You lay out your vows in good faith. You feed them, they dance, they get a chance to see each other. It's a celebration.
The union of both your communities, right?
Yeah,
So the union of my community and his community, so that we could all be one.
That's right. And to evaluate each other to some degree, and to see, you know, I went to one wedding, for example, that was just a complete bloody catastrophe. It was absolutely obvious to everyone there that the wedding was the marriage was a complete sham, and that there wasn't a possibility that this coupling was going to survive. And that would be a good example of, in some ways, the false consensus that you just described, because it was obvious in this case that the groom was completely uncommitted to the process. It was just show. It was so blatantly obvious. It was really quite ugly. And so that would be the ultimate example of the thing that you were concerned about, where there was no real commitment on the part of the participants and there was just the social show. But there's no reason you can't have your cake and eat it too at a wedding. You can bring everyone together in the proper spirit while you're aligned with the proper spirit. And then
should I
you've
feel
done both
guilty
things
having
right.
sex before, or should I nip it in the butt? What would an honorable man of God do if he knows in his heart, I feel like this is my wife, but now I'm playing the game of like I have to wait until she's my wife in public?
Well, okay,
like,
I would say two things about that. The first is you could experiment and find out. Two things. There's two approaches. You could experiment and find out, because you might want to find out, given that you've already played to some degree with abstinence and found it useful under some circumstances, you might want to play with that and see where that goes. Because you don't know. It might be better for both of you if you didn't have sex before you were married. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but I am saying that you don't know if that's the case.
Yeah.
Like it might be the kind of sacrificial offering that cements your marriage in place. Who knows?
But
It
who
might-
am I sacrificing it for? My parents or God? Because if I think
don't
that God
know.
sees it in a way that all I need is the permission of the Father, then I don't care to play the
Well,
dance
that's why
with
I
other
said.
people.
That's why I said you could experiment, because you could find out that way.
I guess that I see this way in the same with baptism, right? And oh my God, this might piss a lot of people off, but hey. Baptism. I was baptized as a baby. But then I read the Bible and this is baptism is like a proposal and it's like a marriage and it's a covenant before God. So my mother arranged that without my permission nor my heart.
Yeah.
So is that meaningless? So now when I have
I don't think it's meaningless, but it is missing something that you're pointing to. It's not meaningless because it was part of a ceremony for your mother, right? And it was part of her hopes for your future. It's part of the family lore. You know this happened. It's a way that you were brought into the community technically. It sets a pattern, but then it's missing. What you're pointing to is something that's missing, which
Love.
is that, it's more voluntary conscious participation, right? And so there's certainly an element of baptism that you could point to that's quite concrete, that's a matter of making the decision to open yourself up to the pathway of God, because that's what you're doing when you're baptized, right? So I'll tell you something about baptism that's quite interesting. So when Christ is baptized in the Gospels, it's right before he goes into the desert.
before he fasts by John the
That's
Baptist.
partly because when you open yourself up to the descent of the Holy Spirit, so to speak, when you open yourself up to God, one of the first things that will make itself manifest is all the ways that you're not there, right? That's the same as the desert. Now, it's not by fluke, by the way, so the story continues, right? Because Christ is in the desert for 40 days, and that's where he meets Satan himself.
Gets tempted.
Well, and so what happens is that once you orient yourself upward, once you open yourself up to that possibility, the desert makes itself manifest. And if that's a form of, what would you say? That's a form of alienation from God. That's a good way of thinking about it. The ultimate extent, the ultimate manifestation of that is dwelling in the presence of Satan. And that's exactly what happens. And so what that means practically is that once you orient yourself upward and you start to understand how you're lost, if you dig to the bottom of that, you'll find the author of all evil, right, dwelling within you. And so that's right, that's true. So it's the same, to tie this back to what we talked about earlier, is when I was curious I'll tell you a story, so it's relevant to this. So when I was in Edmonton doing my first degree, I was about 21, something like that. And I had this professor, he's a very strange guy, adjunct professor, so he wasn't a full-time professor at the university, he was a part-time specialist they brought in. He was the prison psychologist at the Edmonton Maximum Security Prison. And the Edmonton Maximum Security Prison was a bad place. It was full of like monstrous people. And he took me out there a couple of times. And one of the times, The first time I really remember, he left me in the gym with these guys, and they were all like weightlifting monsters and scarred up, and they all surrounded me and offered to trade. I had a kind of a fancy coat on, like a cloak, and they asked me to trade clothing with them, and he had vanished somewhere. I was surrounded by these like monstrous characters, and so that was rather unsettled. But then,
What did you say to them when they asked you to change clothes?
Well, I wanted to ask, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Of course, that's exactly that question. I actually don't remember. I think what I did was tell them the truth, which is what you should always do in a situation like that. Like if you're on very, very shaky ground, that's when it's very important to be very humble and do nothing but tell the truth. And that's especially true if you're dealing with dangerous people, especially if they're paranoid. Because if they're suspicious of you and you lie,
It's over.
you are in such trouble. Anyways, this little guy came out and came into the group where I was, and he told me that the psychologist had asked him for me to accompany him, this guy that came up. And he was just a little kind of not unprepossessing guy.
Was
Certainly
he part of the monsters, or was he part of you guys?
He was one of the prisoners, but he wasn't one of the more monstrous ones. Well, at least not by appearance. Well, he took me out into the yard. It's kind of like a high school. That's what this place looked like, except with thicker doors and so forth. He took me out into the exercise yard, and we got about 100 yards away, probably something like that. And then the psychologist showed back up and beckoned us back, and so we went back, and I went into his office, and he told me about this guy. He said, that guy, he's in prison for life. I said, why? He said, well, two cops pulled him over, and he was armed, and he took both of them out into the ditch, and he shot them both in the back of the head while they were begging for their lives. And so, and they told me that they had little kids, and I thought, oh. And he was perfectly like harmless looking, nondescript person. So that was interesting. And then I met another guy there who, he and one of his friends found out that another prisoner was snitching, and they took him down and pulverized one of his legs with a lead pipe. They just beat it to a pulp. And I thought about both these guys for like 3 weeks. I just thought about them and nothing else, mostly to try to figure out. I thought, oh, geez, how did this guy do that in the ditch? How did these people hold this guy down and pulverize his leg? And I tried to imagine doing it. Imagine putting myself in a position where I could do it, acting. I was acting, trying to embody that. And after about 2 weeks, I had a realization, and the realization was that I could do that. And that was quite a shock, and that really changed me. It changed me a lot, and permanently, because I thought that before that, I had kind of a deep belief that those sorts of things were off the table for me, that people who could do that were somehow qualitatively different than me. And that turned out not to be the case. And so now I forgot why I was telling. Oh yes, I remember why.
It's a great story.
Well, see, that realization of the capacity of malevolence to dwell within you, that's no different than what Christ encountered in the desert. It's the same thing. If you get to the bottom of your weaknesses, what you find, your true weaknesses, you'll find the author of all evil. That's literally the case. Now, what does that mean metaphysically?
I think I went through what you're about to explain to me, and I explained to them this. I think that's why fasting is so important, because when you're hungry and frustrated, you realize who you really are. When you separate yourself from... I explained it this way.
How long did you fast?
I only fasted for a little bit, but it was the example of like while I was irritated.
Oh, yeah.
The term hangry.
Okay.
Or like just not dealing with it. Or I'm too tired, or I'm exhausted, and you're not performing at your highest level. And I basically wrote it this way. A good man is not a good man when he's only good when he's good.
Right.
So,
right, exactly.
So
definitely.
This is where I'm coming to.
Definitely.
And I think this is why God wants you to fast, not only as a sacrament, but he wants to reveal who you are in front of yourself.
Under conditions of deprivation. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. That's a good point. Yeah, that because you're pushing yourself to a kind of limit, and you can understand the strength of your appetites more profoundly in consequence of that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
So,
How do you pray?
are you asking for instructions, or are you asking for me personally?
Both. Both. I want to know how a doctor in your position, because I feel like not only are you good with your words.
First you confess.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's walk through that.
Do you start by confessing?
You have to.
Okay, because you said that asking even a question is a form of
That's
confession.
right. Good. That's right. That's exactly why. That's exactly why. Well, so if
So you have to be
if you're
humble.
in the podcast, if you're in a podcast and something comes to mind that you don't know, the question is a confession. The question is, I don't understand that. That's an admission of ignorance. Okay, so now in a conversation, if you admit ignorance, then in theory, an answer will be delivered to you. That's what you're hoping for, because so it's the same thing psychologically or spiritually. Like once you admit that you have the insufficiency, and you do that on your knees, which means not only do you admit the insufficiency, but you admit that you admit the insufficiency, and you indicate simultaneously that you would like it rectified. Both of those require humility, right? It's like, I'm stupid, and I'd rather not be.
Wisdom's a gift.
Right. Okay. So now there's a sacrifice there. There's a sacrifice of pride, for example. There's also the willingness to sacrifice further, because you know this, everyone knows this. If you want to learn something, you might, and it might not be pleasant, and likely it won't be, because if there's something that you've really got wrong and you learn how wrong you are, that's going to hurt. Okay. So the prayer, confession, that's first. You have to have a problem. The next is, it's something like knock and the door will open.
Seek,
right?
Yeah.
Ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. Right. So let's think about that practically.
But also, if you just want to pin that, a lot of people think that's just biblical, but I think I think you could use that for anything. So when people go, why do bad people have good things? I think because they were working in the realms of how God would want a man to work to thrive. So for example, you said a greedy man, right? He'll get the job done because he's seeking money, and he will find that money. So a lot of people would rather seek money than God. And to me, it's pointless to have. I'm so sorry. Why is this?
Well, and that also might be a lot better than seeking nothing.
Exactly. But also, here's another thing that it's all perspective. If you zoom out, everything besides God to me is nothing. Because unless your deity is endless and eternally, like the space that continues, like, for example, like your opinion regardless of how I see your stature is so much higher than mine, but at the end of the day, you will be forgotten about, and everything that you've done will turn into dirt.
Well, so, some of it developing that, some of that's a matter of definition in a sense. It's like, why would you not turn your attention always to what is highest? Like, why would you do that?
Because greed.
Foolish. Well, yeah, I know, but like, it's just, that's the same problem again, is that if you have identified a pathway that is of true worth, you're a fool to substitute anything lesser for that. So Christ says, for example, that you should store up treasure in heaven rather than the treasure on earth that can
collect moth.
Yes, and rust, exactly, or be stolen. And that, again, it's very practical. It means, so for example, the true wealth that you'll store up in relationship to your wife is her goodwill.
And you can't buy that, and it can't be stolen.
It can't be stolen. It can't be stolen. And you will build up that goodwill in precise proportion to how much you genuinely give her. And I don't mean like gifts. I mean
Serve her.
Precisely, because then she's, to the degree that you're doing that with her best interest in mind, assuming that she's not bent and warped in 15 different ways, and people tend to be, it's still the best way forward, is that she's going to harbor in her heart the most positive possible view of you. And that is a form of richness that no mere material gifts can garner or replace. It's very, very practical.
That falls in the realm of this. This is what I've been journaling about. A lot of people want to die to experience heaven, but I believe because of Christ and his teachings, you could bring heaven to earth. And if you walk in diligent faith and obedience, like
That's what we're called upon to do.
so you could bring heaven here. And like you were saying, this
Or hell.
Right.
very much true. And I think we dabble more in that than anything else.
I think in some ways, we've had more profound examples of that, in some ways.
The reason why I wanted to bring up prayer is because let's think about this, right?
Oh,
Prayer-
yes, we were going to, let's finish that.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, so the first is the admission of insufficiency, right? And then the next is openness to revelation. Okay. That can happen on an ongoing basis. This is partly why you want to be carefully attentive to your language.
Yeah.
Because partly what you're doing with your utterances is making manifest a set of questions. And if those are very carefully constructed, then you'll receive the answers that you need.
Manifestation is a great term that people love to poke at when they say, you put it out into the universe and it could come forth.
Mm-hmm.
How I see manifestation is, do you have a son?
Mm-hmm.
He has your qualities?
Yes, some of them.
So my Creator and I have the same qualities. So in the beginning was the Word, and when he spoke things into existence, my Creator starts by speaking it. So why would I not start by speaking it?
Hey, fair enough. Well, and again, you can be very practical about that. I mean, the words that you exchange with your wife will shape your family. Right? I mean, it's that straightforward. And so if you get the words right, then that shaping is going to be optimized. That's the case with everyone you deal with.
Proverbs talks about that. And it's so funny because people will say, ooh, that cut deep. But 2,000 years ago, God was saying that your words do cut, but good words could bring healing. But I want to circle back to the prayer because say we're in a spiritual battle, the best trick the adversary could do is remove your weaponry. And I believe that your weaponry is your relationship with Christ. And if you can't communicate with him, if I can't communicate with you during war, we're separated. If a house is divided, it cannot stand.
Okay. And?
I realized that while I was praying, and we talked about this before we started rolling, I would always seek wisdom, faith, knowledge, strength. And I would keep asking and asking and asking. And when I started getting it, I started realizing that there's two men that place themselves before God. The one who wants and the one who is grateful.
See, the temptations that Christ is offered by Satan in the desert is that temptation. So Satan asks Christ to demand of God that he turns the rocks into bread. Well, that's a want. It's treating God like a genie, right? It's instrumental want.
But God chose the will of God before his own wants.
Yeah, well, Christ doesn't do that.
But he
doesn't
answers
ask.
him by scripture. So the only way to fight the adversary is to know your Father. If I'm going into war and I don't know what my tools are, then I'm going to get wiped out clean. Or even worse, I don't even think my opponents are my opponents.
Okay. So
the best
fair enough.
trick the devil did was, one, he doesn't exist. Because if he doesn't exist, then I don't have to worry about it. Navy SEALs are not telling their people that they're coming to attack them. You don't know they're about to attack until it's too late.
There's none of that I disagree with, but I don't understand the question.
I feel like we live in a society that praises God with our mouth, but we don't even really know how to obey and speak to him. The communication is lost. I don't feel like we know how to pray to God. And by the way, this is just it's a very wide.
Yeah, there's not much difference between that and not knowing how to
So
think.
I wanted to know what your perspective on prayer was, not because I'm like quizzing you or I'm trying to get you. I'm just trying to learn because when I see you, I see a man that is greater than I when it comes to reflecting. So I want to take the things that you've learned.
I would say that I do my best to pray before every word. And so I can tell you what that means.
Please.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about how language that's designed to impress produces self-consciousness, right? And then it produces a sense of internal disquiet and disunion. It also removes you from the situation because if I'm talking to you and I become self-conscious, then I'm no longer attending to you, right?
Fair.
I fall inside. Okay, so you can feel your words. You can feel your way. It's like the best there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo is making his way across a swamp, a vast swamp, and a dangerous one. If you fall in, you're done. There's a path under the water, but the water is murky. There's a pathway of stones. And as he's walking forward, he can feel the next stone under his feet. Well, that's what you do with your words, is you can feel which words put solid ground under your feet. And I mean literally you can feel it, because if you step wrong, if you use the wrong word, you can feel yourself sinking and coming apart. And so you can learn to attend to that so that you don't say anything that doesn't atone. Atone means at one, right? It means union. Your words have the capacity to unify you and everyone else as well, but you can start with you. And so, and there's a prayer in that, because you have to admit that you might get it wrong and that you'd be tempted to constantly to use your words as a display, let's say. You have to admit that, and then you have to open yourself up to the discovery of that firm ground, and then you have to humble yourself so that's what you say. Now, and you do that in faith, and the faith is fairly straightforward as far as I'm concerned. The faith is, it's as simple as this. You're going to bet your life on your words, one way or another. And maybe with a particular sentence, you're only betting a few minutes of your life, but you're betting your life on your words all the time. Well, are you going to bet on truth or falsehood? That's the fundamental question. And the fundamental declaration of faith in the redeeming word is that there is no better pathway forward than the truth. And then you can decorate that to some degree with another realization, which is regardless of the evidence that makes itself immediately manifest. So let's say I say something and gets me in trouble. This has happened many times. Now, one possibility is that I got in trouble because I was prideful, let's say, in my language. Another possibility is it's going to cause a lot of trouble temporarily. But the medium to long-term consequence is going to be great.
That's what
Right. Okay. So that's part of faith. So this is what happens in the story of Job. So Job falls victim to a bet that God lays with Satan. It's a vicious bet.
Yeah.
So Job is a good man, and God admits that. And Satan comes along and says something
course he
like what
worships
you
you.
said earlier, which is, well, he's only good because everything is easy for him.
Yeah.
And God says, I don't think so. Do your worst.
But you can't touch him.
Yeah, right. Yes. So there's a limit. That's true. Okay, so Job basically loses everything, and he's suffering with some disfiguring illness in the ashes while his friends are telling him why he deserves it. And Job does a variety of things. One thing is his wife says,
curse
you
your
should
God.
curse God and die. Right, that's all that you have left. And Job says, I'm maintaining faith. I'm maintaining faith in the ultimate goodness of the creator of being. And this is, it's a proclamation of faith. It's not a description of what would you say, a conclusion he derived from the evidence. It's not that. It's an insistence. His insistence, it's a noble insistence. In fact, it's the definition of noble insistence. His insistence is, I will do good no matter what. No matter what happens to me. I will do good. No matter what happens to me. It's absolute rejection of the idea of being a victim. It's like, no matter how much suffering comes my way, no matter how much undeserved suffering comes my way, undeserved and unjust, let's say, in spite of my innocence, I will not lose faith and I will do good. Now, the ultimate expression of that occurs in the crucifixion story, clearly. But Job is a step on the way there.
Can I pause you there to learn something from this?
Yeah.
Was it the fact of his faithfulness because he led with God's understanding and not his own? I mean, even his own people were saying, I don't get this. You obviously have done this. And he doesn't even...
To some degree, because See, God makes himself manifest to Job. It's a very complex story, but God makes himself manifest to Job and reminds him that God was there when the foundations of the earth were laid and when Leviathan was defeated, and that Job is in no position to render judgment on God. And that's really the crucial issue, you see, because one of the things you do, if you construe yourself as a victim, you say the world is arrayed against you, and maybe you even go deeper and you say, well, there's so much suffering in the world that it must be a malevolent place. I could not possibly believe in a God that was good, who rules a world as steeped in sin and sorrow as this one. Well, the reminder that God sends Job in the book of Job is that you're not in a position to judge God.
It's a complex situation.
It far more than merely complex.
It's more than just you.
You're simply not in a position to become the judge of being itself. See, this is also what the snake offers Eve in the Garden of Eden.
NASA.
She offers Eve, the snake offers Eve the right to take to herself the full knowledge of value, the full knowledge of good and evil, to make herself the judge of all things.
Yep.
Well, you're not the judge of all things. See, one of the Columbine killers, for example, journaled somewhat extensively. I think his name was Dylan Klebold, if I remember correctly. And I'm identifying him only so we know which one it was. He literally said that he took to himself the right to be the judge of all being, God included, and that he found human beings wanting in a serious manner, and that it was therefore his right to wreak whatever havoc he saw fit. And he wrote things about what possessed him as a consequence of that conclusion that'll make your hair stand on end.
I like the word
them.
possess.
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, he wrote some of that well possessed. It's very disturbing, to say the least. Because I won't go into it any further than that.
I agree.
Look at it.
Yeah, we shouldn't give light to that.
Yeah.
I do have a question, since we were speaking about prayer and, speaking things into, so that, because your thoughts, once you speak it out, right, you give it life. And this is actually something that I had brought up to you yesterday. Remember, we spoke about it. I'm just not sure. But I had read somewhere, and somebody wrote that the devil can't hear your thoughts, right? Like, God knows your heart, and God knows what you're thinking. He knows what you're doing. He knows what you're going to do. And the devil is a very good person he's a very good behavioral, observing your behavior. And so he can almost know your thoughts because he's so good at observing people. And then I was trying to learn about it. I really don't know biblically where it says in the Bible, but I had read somewhere that, nowhere in the Bible it says that angels can read your thoughts. So if angels can't know your thoughts, then a fallen one can't know your thoughts. And I would love to know what your perception of that is, if you think that the devil can know what we are thinking.
Can I before you answer, can I say what I said to her so that way you could take our relationship and I said, I don't need to read my dog's thoughts to know what he's thinking, because I've watched him since he was a puppy till now. Every single decision, every single want. Now, when we pray to God, I believe that a lot of us will either pray privately or we will pray out loud. But regardless of our prayers, our actions are dictating what we are wanting. So I don't think the devil even needs to necessarily hear your inner thoughts to put obstacles to put you in a direction of where he wants you to be. That's where I came through. So,
well, I feel
like we're in counseling.
Since we were on this topic, I was wondering because, and only wondering, not because, when you pray out loud, then, the devil can hear your prayer. And so, no, because the devil is not as powerful as God is. But let's say when you have bad thoughts, right, the more you give light to your bad thoughts, the more you're giving the chance for them to be true. And so in that sense, it's kind of the more that I give light to my bad thoughts, I'm giving the chance for the devil to make those things true. Whereas
there's definitely, so that part of that's definitely the case. Okay, so and we should maybe close with this. This is actually a stellar sort of example. Okay, so in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain makes second-rate sacrifices. That means his work is not good. It means more than that. He knows it too. He offers what's second best to God. And that doesn't work. And it doesn't work because life is so difficult that if you offer what's second rate, yeah, that's just not going to work for you. And so Abel offers what's first rate. And as a consequence, Abel is very successful, whereas Cain hedges his bets. And he is a failure in consequence. And instead of learning from that and straightening up, he doubles down and becomes bitter and resentful. And enough so that he then challenges God. And he basically says something like, what kind of world did you make where my sacrifices are being rejected and I suffer? And God says, if you did well, you would be accepted. Now, this is not what Cain wants to hear, because anyone who's failing voluntarily, the last thing they want to hear is that it's their fault. They want to hear that it's God's fault, or
The first
society's
victim.
fault, or someone else's fault anyways. So God just dispenses with that right away. He says, if you did well, you'd be accepted. Okay, but then he says something else, and this is devastating. This is actually why Cain goes and kills Abel. It's devastating, because it's even more the last thing you want to hear. He says, you failed. But that's not all. You failed, and then as a consequence, you were tempted by something that sat on your doorstep. You were tempted by the spirit of sin. And it sat on your doorstep like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you. And so what he means is you're failing, you're hurt, and maybe that's even understandable, but then you went the next step. That failure and hurt you used that failure and hurt to justify your dalliance with the spirit of resentment and rebellion. You invited it in. You had a relationship with it. You nurtured it. You did something creative with it. You let it grow inside you. And that's why you're in the situation that you're in. And Cain he leaves that conversation, and he is not happy. And that's when he offers to Abel the opportunity to work with him and kills him in the field. Right? And then Cain's descendants there are a variety of people, but one of his descendants is the first person who builds weapons of war. Right? So it's not just, so Cain is murderous, but his descendants are warlike and genocidal. So that's another lesson from that story, is that's where that genocidal spirit comes from, that bitter resentment.
Genetically?
That's a hard question.
That is a
We'll
hard
say
question.
no for now.
Okay.
Well, developmentally anyway, sociologically, right? I mean, the idea in that story is that the psychological cause of the degeneration of societies into genocidal mobs is the resentment that's engendered as a consequence of rejected sacrifices. But more than that, and then the invitation of that spirit within in a creative manner. Well, the Nazis were no shortage of creative in their genocidal brutality.
Well, everybody
Right.
took from their
So-
page. Before we wrap up your academy, I would just
Yes.
love to talk about it. Just because when I sat with you with someone I love, I walked away from this with tools so I could use for my life, and I feel like this would be something that everybody could come. I would love to talk about so people could come and learn from you in this academy.
Well, so I've been working with my team, particularly my daughter and her husband, many others, on a new model for undergraduate level education. Our platform is not accredited, mostly because working with the accreditation agencies would have meant turning the enterprise into exactly the sort of thing that we're trying to provide an alternative to.
Yeah.
Because the accreditation agencies are just as captured as the universities. We'll leave that aside. We've brought together, I'm in a very privileged position insofar as I can find extremely competent and able people all over the world, and they'll talk to me, and then I can find the ones who are stellar communicators and I've invited them to lecture for this academy. And so we have a coterie of about 30 top-rate They're not all professors. Many of them are professors from places like Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Stanford, MIT, etc. Some of them are specialists who develop their knowledge on their own outside of the academy. And we've taken them down to Miami and filmed them teaching the course they most want to teach in front of an audience that's 100% enthusiastic with high-level production quality and great animation. And the academy has a social element because we know that when people go to university, one of the things they're doing is finding a mate and developing a friendship network. And so we're trying to build
A community.
a community in a variety of different ways. And we want to do this, we want to bring this opportunity to people at the lowest possible cost, and that's going to launch within the next couple of months.
We'll
That's
put that in the
wonderful.
description, so if you guys are hungry for that.
Peterson Academy.
So-
You can join the mailing list. We've got about 300,000 people.
And can
on the
they
mailing
go,
list.
they join online for this?
Yep, just go to petersonacademy.com and you can sign up, and then we'll let you know when it's going to launch, but it
Is this
won't be
all
long.
virtual, or is it somewhere that they go and they see?
Well, at the moment, the lectures themselves are delivered in video form, but if there are other people watching them, you'll be able to communicate with the people that are watching them. But we also plan to bring people together in the actual world once the community starts to grow, because you could imagine people could get together to watch lectures. That would work out very nicely. They can host social occasions. We may delve into that ourselves because the social element of university is so important. We're thinking about having conferences in the major cities where if we have enough students, so we could bring professors there and people could gather for 3 days, for example, and listen to their favorite professors teach them, and that's all part of the vision.
This. I feel like this is like your way of the farmer's market when it comes to you know them by their fruits. You've handpicked people that you've enjoyed their fruits, and now you're making like a farmer's market where you could have people come in and like.
Yeah, well, it's quite fun because I can offer these professors. First of all, we treat them very well when they come down to Miami, and we treat them much better than their own universities do by like a lot.
Is that because you were treated bad when you were a professor?
No, it's because I learned from that. Now, I wasn't treated particularly badly when I was a professor, especially not when I taught at Harvard, because Harvard in the 90s when I was there was a very upward aiming organization. And I would say the University of Toronto was not aimed at excellence in the same manner, but mostly it left me the hell alone. And if I was doing my job, was generally supportive. Although that's
a lot.
Eventually, yes, it is a lot.
It's a lot. It's freedom.
Eventually took a serious turn for the worse. But most of the time I spent there, that place was doing its job credibly, not with the same degree of excellence that characterized Harvard, although those days are long gone, unfortunately.
What, just out of curiosity, what years were you at Harvard? Because I know Vivek Ramaswamy went to Harvard.
I was there from 93 to 98.
I was born 93.
I was born 98.
We are your product.
There you go.
It was such a privilege to come here and sit down with you and talk to you. And,
Well, thank you for journeying all the way out here to Vancouver Island, and thank you for talking to me and for delving into these things. Hopefully it'll be helpful to the people who are watching and listening. And it was
Most
good to
definitely.
meet both of you.
Amen.
Thank you so
And
much.
it went well. Those were good questions. And
Thank you so much.
you bet.
Thank you
I
so much for
appreciate
your
it.
thoughtfulness.
That was awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.